What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today I've got something that'll give you goosebumps. 6 scary true stories from the Appalachian Mountains that actually happened to real people. Trust me, after hearing these creepy encounters, you'll never want to wander into those dark mountains alone again. But hey, before we jump into these bone-chilling tales, smash that subscribe button and hit like if you love horror stories. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. All right, let's get into these terrifying encounters that'll haunt your dreams tonight. I'm 45 years old, and I've been maintaining cell towers across West Virginia for the past 15 years. It's honest work, pays the bills, and I get to spend most of my days driving through some of the most beautiful mountains you'll ever see. My name's David, and I've climbed more towers than I can count, fixed everything from storm damage to equipment failures, and I thought I'd seen it all. That was before I got the call about Bear Mountain. The service report came in on a Tuesday morning in late October. Signal interference at our remote tower up on Bear Mountain, about 40 miles northeast of Charleston. The automated systems were showing weird readings, nothing catastrophic, but enough to warrant a service call. I figured it was standard stuff, maybe weather damage from the storms we'd had the week before, or some piece of equipment finally giving up after years of mountain weather. I loaded up my truck with the usual gear, spectrum analyzer, replacement parts, toolkit, and headed up the winding service road that cuts through the national forest. Bear Mountain Tower sits in the middle of absolutely nowhere. The access road is barely more than a dirt track that winds up through thick hardwood forest for about 6 miles before you reach the clearing where they built the tower back in the early 2000s. On a good day, it takes about an hour to drive up there from the main highway. That particular morning, with the leaves just starting to turn and a light fog hanging in the valleys, it was actually pretty peaceful. The tower looked fine from the ground. No visible storm damage, no broken guy wires, nothing obviously wrong with the structure itself. But when I started running diagnostics on the equipment, that's when things got interesting. The interference wasn't coming from failed hardware, it was coming from outside sources, multiple outside sources. I pulled out my spectrum analyzer and started scanning the frequencies, trying to isolate where the interference was originating. What I found didn't make any sense. I was picking up signals on frequencies that shouldn't have had anything on them. Not just random electromagnetic noise either. These signals had patterns, organized patterns. They were transmitting in synchronized bursts like some kind of coordinated communication network. But there wasn't supposed to be any other equipment operating in that area, especially not on those specific frequencies. I've been doing this work long enough to know my equipment, and I trust my instruments. The spectrum analyzer was showing me signal sources scattered throughout the forest around the tower. Not just 1 or 2 sources, dozens of them, and they were all talking to each other in some kind of pattern I'd never seen before. The signals would hop frequencies following no protocol I recognized, change power levels randomly, and maintain impossible range for the power signatures I was detecting. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at equipment failure. I was looking at someone operating a sophisticated communication network in the middle of the West Virginia wilderness. Someone who didn't want to be found. I spent the next hour using my directional antenna to track the signal sources. Most of them seemed to be coming from deep in the forest, at least a half mile from the tower clearing. But here's the thing that really got my attention. As I moved around the base of the tower, the signals started reacting to my presence. The pattern changed. They were tracking me. I've worked alone in remote locations for years, and you develop instincts about when something's not right. Every instinct I had was telling me to pack up and leave. But I'm also a professional, and I needed to understand what was causing the interference before I could file my report. So I grabbed my portable spectrum analyzer and headed into the woods to find the source of the nearest signal. About a quarter mile into the forest, following a bearing that should have led me to the strongest signal source, I found something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Attached to a large oak tree, about 8 feet off the ground, was a device unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't manufactured. It looked grown. The outer shell had the translucent, wet quality of fresh cartilage, with dark veins running through it like blood vessels. Electronic components were embedded in what I can only describe as flesh, circuit boards nestled in pockets of organic tissue that pulsed with a faint blue-green bioluminescence. The rhythm matched the heartbeat-like pattern of the signals I was tracking. When I got closer, I could smell it. A metallic copper scent mixed with something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. The device was warm to the touch, and I swear I could feel it breathing. The electronic parts weren't just embedded in the organic material, they were integrated with it. Copper wire traced along what looked like nerve pathways, and the central processor was partially covered by a membrane that contracted and expanded like a lung. I found 12 more devices over the next hour, all of them attached to trees, all of them looking like they'd grown there rather than been installed. Some looked newer, with the organic tissue still pink and raw where it was bonding with the tree bark. Others seemed to have been there for years, completely embedded in the living wood, with root-like tendrils extending deep into the tree's vascular system. The older devices had developed thick, leathery skin that made them almost indistinguishable from tree burls, except for the faint glow that pulsed beneath the surface. And all of them were part of a network that was specifically designed to track human electromagnetic signatures. I'm not talking about generic radio frequency monitoring. Ings were cataloging heartbeats, brainwave patterns, the specific electrical signatures of different organs. They knew exactly how many humans were in their territory at any given moment, where we were, and what we were doing. The pattern of devices created a grid that covered several square miles. They were monitoring everything: radio signals, cell phones, GPS units, even the electrical systems in vehicles. But more than that, they were learning. I watched the signal patterns adapt in real time as I moved through the forest. They were studying human behavior, mapping our movement patterns, understanding our technology. That's when I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't a communication network, it was a hunting system. My radio went dead first, then my cell phone, then the GPS unit in my truck. One by one, every piece of electronic equipment I had stopped working. But it wasn't just failure, it was targeted. The devices were sending out focused electromagnetic pulses, specific frequencies designed to disable human technology without affecting their own network. And then they started emitting a sound that bypassed my ears entirely. It resonated in my bones, made my teeth feel like they were coming loose in my jaw. My vision started to tunnel, and I could taste copper in my mouth. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a signal, a dinner bell. I ran back toward my truck as fast as I could move through the forest, but the sound followed me. It was coming from every device in the network now, all of them calling to something deeper in the woods, something that was answering. I could hear it moving through the trees, not footsteps, but a wet, sliding sound, like something massive dragging itself through the underbrush, multiple somethings. The signal pattern on my spectrum analyzer showed at least 3 distinct sources converging on my location. Whatever these devices were designed to hunt, it was coming. By the time I reached the clearing, the electrical system in my truck was completely dead. No lights, no engine, no radio. Nothing. I could hear the things getting closer. That wet, sliding sound accompanied by a rhythmic clicking that sounded almost like echolocation. They were coordinating their approach, using the organic network to triangulate my exact position. I was trapped in a clearing with nowhere to run, surrounded by predators I couldn't see, using technology I couldn't understand. The sound from the devices was getting louder, more insistent. And underneath it, I could hear something else. Breathing. Deep, wet breathing that didn't sound like it came from lungs. Looking back now, I think the only reason I'm still alive is because I remembered something from my military training about electromagnetic warfare. I pulled the battery out of my truck and used my jumper cables to create a crude electromagnetic pulse. Not enough to hurt me, but enough to overload the electronics in those organic devices. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Every device in the network let out what I can only describe as a scream, not electronic feedback, but an actual organic sound of pain. The blue-green glow flickered and died, and the wet sliding sounds in the forest stopped abruptly. Whatever was hunting me had just lost its eyes and ears, but I also heard something else. Rage. Deep, alien rage from something that had been using those devices for a very long time. Something that didn't appreciate having its hunting tools destroyed. I had maybe 30 seconds before they started coming back online. I reconnected the battery, said every prayer I could remember, and turned the key. The truck started. I drove down that mountain faster than I've ever driven in my life, and I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway with cell phone coverage and other people around. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. When I tried to report what I'd found to the company, they didn't just dismiss me, they were actively hostile. My supervisor, Jerry Hendricks, pulled me into his office the next morning with two men I'd never seen before. Government types, from the look of them. They had questions about my military background, my security clearance, my family situation. They wanted to know who I'd talked to, what I'd told them. When I pushed back, Jerry made it very clear that my job, my pension, and potentially my freedom depended on keeping my mouth shut. "Some things are above your pay grade, David," he said. "Some things are being handled by people who know what they're doing." That's when I realized the company knew. They'd always known. The interference reports, the service calls to remote towers, they weren't random. They were part of something bigger, something that required regular human contact with those devices. And technicians like me were expendable test subjects. I still work for the same company, and I still maintain towers across West Virginia. But I won't take service calls for Bear Mountain anymore. I told them the access road is too dangerous for single-person crews, which is true enough. Jerry didn't argue. He just smiled and assigned those calls to newer employees. 3 of them haven't come back. Sometimes, when I'm working on other remote towers, I'll scan the spectrum just to see what's out there. Those signals are spreading. I've detected similar patterns near 6 other tower sites in the past 2 years. Always in remote locations, always tracking human activity, always connected to devices that look more grown than built. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. The signals are getting stronger, more sophisticated. The network is learning, adapting, growing, and the hunting grid is expanding beyond the deep woods. Last month, I picked up similar signatures near populated areas. Suburban developments, shopping centers, schools. I've tried to warn other technicians, but the ones who listen either quit or disappear. The ones who don't listen, well, some of them come back changed. They'll work the mountain, towers without complaint, never ask questions about weird readings, never seem bothered by the isolation. And sometimes, when I look at them closely, I can see a faint blue-green glow behind their eyes. I don't sleep well anymore. Every electronic device in my house feels like it's watching me. My cell phone, my laptop, my smart TV. They all emit the same frequencies I detected in those organic devices. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that wet, sliding sound in the walls. The truth is, I don't think we were ever the dominant species on this planet. I think we've just been tolerated, studied, cataloged. And now that the study is complete, the real purpose of that network is becoming clear. They're not just hunting individuals anymore. They're preparing for something bigger, something that requires detailed knowledge of human behavior, human technology, human weaknesses. To this day, I won't work alone on any tower more than 20 miles from civilization. And I always carry a spare battery and jumper cables just in case. But I know it won't matter in the end. The network is too big now, too sophisticated, and we taught them everything they need to know about us. I just hope I'm wrong about what comes next. I was 19 when it happened, working graveyard shifts at Murphy's Gasco to scrape together tuition money for the community college. December of 2019. Most kids my age were home for Christmas break, but I was covering extra shifts, trying to bank enough hours to maybe take spring semester off and focus on my grades. My manager had this policy where if you worked Christmas Eve, you got 3 days off afterward, so I figured I'd drive down to see my parents after my shift ended Christmas morning. The drive should have been 3 hours, but gas was eating up half my paycheck. This regular customer, old guy named Dale, who bought Copenhagen and scratch-offs every Tuesday, mentioned this back road that cut through the mountains, said it would save me 40 miles and about an hour. I'd driven those interstates a dozen times, Figured some mountain scenery might be nice for once. The road started normal enough. State Route 9 turned into County Road 47, which turned into this unmarked blacktop winding between ridges covered in bare hardwoods. My Honda Civic wasn't exactly built for mountain driving, but it was handling okay. Then the weather shifted. You know how mountain storms come out of nowhere? One minute I'm listening to Christmas music on the radio, next minute I can't see past my headlights. Snow started as flurries, then fat flakes, then this sideways mess that turned everything white. My GPS died first, just that blue dot spinning in circles, then nothing. Cell service went next. The road got slick fast, and my car started fishtailing on these hairpin curves. I was going maybe 15 miles an hour, white-knuckling the steering wheel, when I came around this sharp bend and the back end just let go. I felt that sickening moment when you realize you're not driving anymore. You're just along for the ride. The Honda slid sideways off the asphalt, through some young pine trees, and into this gully that dropped maybe 8 feet below the road level. The airbag didn't deploy, but I smacked my head pretty good on the side window. When I tried to restart the car, the engine turned over once, made this grinding noise like metal on metal, then nothing. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, hoping another car would come by, but the snow was getting heavier, and I hadn't seen headlights in either direction for the past hour. My phone was dead. The cold had killed what little battery I had left. That's when I noticed the lights. Through the snow and trees, maybe a quarter mile up the ridge, I could see this warm yellow glow, like windows lit up from inside. There was even smoke rising from what looked like a chimney. I grabbed my purse and phone charger and started hiking toward those lights. My sneakers were soaked through in 30 seconds, but that house looked so welcoming. It was an old farmhouse, the kind you see in pictures of Appalachia from 50 years ago. 2 stories, big covered porch, wooden shutters that actually looked functional. Smoke was definitely coming from the chimney, and I could see the flicker of what might have been a fire through the front windows. I knocked on the door, and this elderly woman answered. She was small, maybe 5'2", with silver hair pinned up and wearing a blue house dress with tiny flowers on it. When she saw me standing there shivering, her face just lit up with concern. "Lord have mercy, child, you're half frozen," she said, and her voice had that mountain accent that makes every word sound like music. She pulled me inside before I could even explain what happened. The warmth hit me like a wall. There was this massive stone fireplace with a real wood fire crackling, and the whole house smelled like cooking food and old wood and something else, something earthy and rich that I couldn't quite place. She sat me down in this chair right by the fire and went bustling off to get me dry clothes and something hot to drink. That's when I met her family. 3 sons, all grown men, probably in their 40s. The youngest one, Tommy, she called him, was still wearing work clothes with sawdust on them. The middle son, Carl, was bigger, with these massive hands that looked like they could split logs barehanded. The oldest, Ezra, was quiet, just nodded when his mother introduced me. They all worked at the sawmill down in the valley, she explained. Good, honest work. Mrs. Crane, that was her name, Ruth Crane, brought me this thick wool sweater and a pair of heavy socks, then ladled me out a bowl of stew from a pot that had been simmering on this old cast-iron stove. It was the best beef stew I'd ever tasted, rich and savory, with this depth of flavor that you can't get from store-bought meat. The sons said they'd take a look at my car first thing in the morning, after the storm passed. I felt incredibly lucky. Here I was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, and I'd stumbled onto probably the only house for miles with the kindest people you could imagine. Mrs. Crane kept fussing over me, asking if I was warm enough, if I needed more stew, if my head hurt from the accident. It felt like being wrapped up in my grandmother's arms. She showed me around the house while the stew settled in my stomach. It was larger than it looked from outside, with these narrow hallways and low ceilings that made everything feel cozy. The downstairs had a kitchen, a sitting room, and what she called the pantry. When we passed by this heavy wooden door that led to the basement, I caught a whiff of something strong and metallic, like a butcher shop, but more intense. "That's where we do our processing," Mrs. Crane explained when she saw me pause. "These boys are mighty fine hunters. We don't waste nothing that the good Lord provides." Made sense. People out here probably did most of their own food preparation. Still, the smell was overwhelming, rich and coppery and somehow warm, like it was fresh. In the kitchen, I noticed they didn't have much in the way of store-bought food. No cereal boxes or bread or canned goods that I could see. Just fresh vegetables in bushel baskets and a lot of meat in the refrigerator. The cutting boards were thick butcher block maple, stained dark with use, and there were these heavy knives hanging from magnetic strips, not kitchen knives, but the kind you'd use for serious butchering work. The conversation over dinner was pleasant enough. They asked about my schooling, my family, what I was studying. I told them about my major, pre-nursing, and Mrs. Crane's eyes just lit up. "A healer," she said. "That's a blessed calling." The sons mostly listened, but when they did talk, it was about their work at the mill, about the weather, about hunting. They mentioned hunting a lot, how this was their favorite time of year for it, how the snow made tracking easier, how they'd been having their best season in years, which struck me as odd since I was pretty sure deer season had ended weeks ago. But maybe they had different rules up here, or maybe they were talking about different game. When I asked about neighbors, Mrs. Crane mentioned that the nearest house was quite a ways off. "We like our privacy," she said, and her sons all nodded. "City folks don't understand the mountain way, how we take care of our own, how we make do with what we have." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. They gave me this upstairs bedroom with a quilted bedspread that must have been handmade, and the sound of the wind through the pine trees was like a lullaby. I woke up feeling rested for the first time in months. After breakfast, more of that incredible stew, though Mrs. Crane called it yesterday's leavings, Tommy offered to walk down and take a look at my car. The snow had stopped, but it was deep, maybe 8 inches, and my footprints from the night before were completely covered. When we got to the car, Tommy whistled low. "She's in there pretty good," he said, wading through the snow to peer under the hood. That's when I saw what had happened to my car. Someone had removed the spark plugs, all 4 of them, and my tires weren't just damaged from the slide. They'd been cut, deliberately slashed with something sharp. "Looks like someone got to her during the night," Tommy said, but his voice was flat, like he was reading lines from a script. "Probably kids from down in town. They come up here sometimes, looking for trouble." I stared at those cut tires, at the empty spark plug wells, and felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Why would kids do that? Why would anyone do that? Tommy shrugged. People do strange things when they think nobody's watching. But we were 20 miles from the nearest town. What kids would hike 20 miles through the mountains in a blizzard just to vandalize a car? Walking back to the house, I started paying closer attention to things I'd missed before, like how there weren't any power lines running to the house, but they had electric lights, like how the meat in the refrigerator wasn't packaged. It was just wrapped in white butcher paper, but the cuts were irregular, not like anything you'd get from a store or even a local butcher. At lunch, I watched the family eat. They served vegetables, potatoes, carrots, some kind of preserved greens, but I noticed they only pushed them around their plates. The meat, though, they ate with genuine enthusiasm. And their teeth, God, how had I not noticed their teeth before? They were all filed to points, not just the canines, but most of their teeth, shaped into these sharp triangular peaks. When I asked about it, Mrs. Crane smiled, and those pointed teeth made her look like something pretending to be human. "Old family tradition," she said. "Goes back generations. Helps with the eating." That afternoon, Mrs. Crane told me more about their family history, how the Cranes had been living on this land since before the Civil War, how they'd survived winters when the roads were impassable for months, when supply wagons couldn't get through, when neighbors died of starvation while the Cranes thrived. My great-great-grandfather, Josiah Crane, he learned the secret to surviving when others couldn't, she said, rocking in her chair by the fire. He understood that the good Lord provides in many ways, if you're willing to see his gifts for what they are. The way she said gifts made my skin crawl. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those filed teeth, those cut tires, the way Tommy's expression had gone flat when he talked about kids vandalizing my car. Around midnight, I heard sounds from downstairs. Heavy footsteps, voices murmuring, and then this rhythmic chopping sound, like someone splitting kindling. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. The voices were coming from the basement. I could make out words. Tender around the shoulders. Save the good cuts for Sunday. Waste nothing. I had to see. I had to know what they were doing down there. The basement stairs creaked, but not loud enough to cover the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. There was a light on down there, just a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the smell that had been hinting around the edges of the house hit me full force. Copper and iron and meat and something sweet sick that made my stomach lurch. They had bodies hanging from hooks in the ceiling, human bodies in various stages of butchering. Some were so fresh the blood was still dripping into buckets placed underneath. Others were aged, the meat dark and marbled. There were body parts arranged on tables like cuts in a butcher shop, arms and legs and sections of torso wrapped in, and that same white paper I'd seen in the refrigerator. On one of the tables I recognized a jacket, blue denim with a Carhartt label. I'd seen it on the news 3 weeks ago, worn by a hiker who'd gone missing on the mountain trails. The search had been called off after 5 days. I backed toward the stairs, but my foot hit something. A bucket full of what looked like organ meat. It tipped over, spilling across the concrete floor with a wet slapping sound. The chopping stopped. "Mama!" came Tommy's voice from somewhere in the darkness beyond the hanging bodies. "We got company." I ran. Up the stairs, through the kitchen, straight to the front door. But it was locked, and not with a simple deadbolt. There was a heavy wooden bar across it, the kind you'd use to keep things out, or to keep things in. "Now, Sarah," Mrs. Crane's voice came from behind me, calm and patient. "Where you going, honey? It's cold out there. Dangerous." I turned around. All 4 of them were standing there watching me. Mrs. Crane still in her house dress, the 3 sons still wearing their work clothes, but now I could see the dark stains on their shirts and hands that I'd somehow missed before. "You saw the pantry," Mrs. Crane said. It wasn't a question. I nodded because my voice had abandoned me entirely. "Well then, I suppose we need to have ourselves a conversation." They sat me down at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Crane made tea like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just discovered they were killing and eating people. She set a cup in front of me with steady hands and settled into her chair with that same grandmotherly smile. "The Crane family has been living on this mountain for 6 generations, she began. "We survived the Civil War when the Confederate Army took every scrap of food for 50 miles. We survived the winter of 1899 when the snow stayed on the ground from October to May. We survived the Depression when people in the valley were eating tree bark." She sipped her tea. "We survived because we understood something that most folks can't accept. The good Lord provides for those with the wisdom to see his gifts. When the deer are scarce, when the crops fail, when the stores close and the roads wash out, he still provides. Through travelers who lose their way, through hunters who wander too far from their groups, through young folks who take shortcuts they shouldn't take." Carl spoke up for the first time. His voice was deeper than I'd expected, with that same musical mountain accent. "We don't hunt for sport, girl. We hunt for survival. Always have." "Your car didn't slide off that road by accident," Ezra added. "We've been watching for someone like you for weeks. Young, healthy, traveling alone. When the storm hit, we knew it was time." Mrs. Crane reached across the table and patted my hand with her small, warm fingers. "We're not evil people, Sarah. We're survivors. And now you're going to help us survive." They kept me in that upstairs bedroom for the next week. The door locked from the outside, the windows nailed shut. Mrs. Crane brought me meals 3 times a day. Always that stew, always with that rich, complex flavor that I now understood came from ingredients I didn't want to think about. At first, I couldn't keep it down. My body would reject it violently, and I'd spend hours retching into the chamber pot they'd left for me. But Mrs. Crane was patient. She'd clean up the mess, bring me fresh stew, and wait for me to try again. "Your body knows what it needs," she'd say. "You just got to stop fighting it." By the 4th day, I was keeping the food down. By the 6th day, I was looking forward to mealtime. The stew tasted good, better than good. It satisfied something deep in my belly that regular food had never touched. On the 7th day, Mrs. Crane brought me down to help with dinner preparation. "You're family now," she said. "Time you learned the family business." She taught me how to identify the best cuts, how to tend, to rise tough muscle, how to render fat for cooking. She explained their system, how they watched the roads during winter storms, how they disabled vehicles, how they chose their guests. Not, "Everyone's suitable," she explained, guiding my hands as I learned to bone a section of meat I tried not to look at too closely. "Gotta be young, gotta be healthy, gotta be alone. No point in taking someone who'll be missed right away." They told me about their plans for me. Come spring, when the roads cleared and travel picked up again, I'd help them identify suitable travelers. Young women were especially good for this, Mrs. Crane explained. People trusted young women. I could flag down cars, ask for help, lead people back to the house. "You'll be our hunting partner," Tommy said, and the way he smiled with those filed teeth made my stomach twist. But the worst part was that I was starting to understand their logic. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, completely cut off during winter storms, what other choice did they have? It was survival, pure and simple. They weren't monsters. They were people who'd adapted to circumstances that would have killed anyone else. My chance came during the 2nd week, when a snowplow driver stopped by to check on them. This was their test for me. Could I act normal? Could I keep the family secret? Could I help them identify a new addition to their pantry? The driver was a man in his 50s, probably someone's grandfather, just doing his job and making sure the old folks were okay during the storm. When he knocked on the door, Mrs. Crane positioned me right where he could see me and told me to smile and wave. "That's my great-niece Sarah," she told him when he asked. "Visiting from down in Lexington. Couldn't make it back before the storm hit." The driver smiled at me and tipped his cap. Nice man, kind eyes. Probably had a wife who worried when he was late getting home from his routes. I waved back and kept smiling until he climbed back in his plow truck and drove away. Then I listened to the family make plans for his return trip when he'd be tired and less cautious, when they could disable his truck and add him to their winter stores. That night, I lay in my bed and tried to figure out what I'd become. 2 weeks ago, I was Sarah Mitchell, nursing student, gas station clerk, ordinary 19-year-old worried about tuition payments. Now I was someone who could smile and wave while marking a good man for death. The family noticed the change in me. Mrs. Crane started leaving my door unlocked. The sons included me in their conversations about hunting and tracking. They were grooming me, turning me into one of them, and the terrifying thing was how natural it felt. When the snowplow driver came back 3 days later, I was the one who flagged him down. I was the one who told him our truck wouldn't start, who asked if he could take a look under the hood. I was the one who led him around to the back of the house where Tommy was waiting with a tire iron. I told myself I didn't have a choice, that it was him or me, that I was just trying to survive until I could find a way to escape. But when Mrs. Crane praised me for doing such a good job, when she called me her clever girl and hugged me with those small, strong arms, I felt proud. That's when I knew I was lost. The escape happened by accident more than design. 3 weeks into my stay, I was helping Mrs. Crane prepare dinner when she asked me to fetch something from the pantry. Not the basement pantry. There was a smaller storage room off the kitchen where they kept their tools and processing equipment. I was looking for the meat grinder when I knocked over this old kerosene lamp. It shattered against the concrete floor, spreading burning fuel across the room in seconds. The flames reached some old burlap sacks in the corner, then some wooden shelves, then the walls themselves. Mrs. Crane started screaming for her sons, but they were outside doing something with the snowplow driver's truck. I could have helped her put out the fire. Should have helped her. Instead, I ran. The kitchen door wasn't barred during the day. They trusted me now, trusted that I'd become one of them. I ran out into the snow wearing just my sweater and jeans. No coat, no shoes, nothing. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Crane shouting for her boys, could see smoke starting to pour from the kitchen windows. The snow was knee-deep, and my feet went numb almost immediately, but I kept running. I had maybe a 10-minute head start before they'd come after me, and I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. I made it maybe half a mile before I heard them behind me. They knew these woods better than I ever could, and they were dressed for the weather. My trail through the snow was easy to follow, and I was slowing down as hypothermia set in. They caught up with me at this frozen creek, maybe a mile from the house. All three sons, moving through the snow like it was nothing. Behind them, I could see an orange glow where the house was burning. "You killed Mama," Carl said, and his voice was different now, flat and cold and full of promise. I still had the meat grinder handle in my hand. I'd been carrying it without realizing it when I ran. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was heavy cast iron with a sharp edge where the clamp mechanism attached. When Tommy came at me first, I swung it as hard as I could, caught him in the temple, and he went down hard, blood spreading across the snow like spilled paint. Ezra came next, and I got him in the throat, but Carl grabbed me from behind, and we both went down, rolling toward the creek. The ice was thinner than it looked. When Carl's weight hit it, we both crashed through into water so cold it felt like being electrocuted. But I was smaller, lighter, and I managed to grab onto the edge and pull myself out. Carl went under and didn't come back up. Ezra was still alive but not moving much, making these wet gurgling sounds and clutching his throat. Could have helped him. Could have tried to stop the bleeding. Instead, I picked up a rock and finished what I'd started. Then I took their coats and boots and started walking. The search team found me 2 days later, hypothermic and delirious, walking along the main highway about 15 miles from where my car had slid off the road. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, frostbite, malnutrition, severe dehydration, and what the doctors called acute stress reaction. The authorities investigated what was left of the Crane house after the fire. They found human remains in the basement, but not enough to piece together the whole story. Most people think I had some kind of psychological break from the trauma and invented the worst details. They never found the bodies of the 3 sons. The creek was too deep, the current too strong. By spring, they could have been carried miles downstream. I finished my nursing degree, but I never worked in a hospital. Too many people, too much noise, too many strangers asking questions. I manage a small clinic now in a town where everyone knows everyone else and nobody asks about my scars. I lost 2 toes and the tip of my ring finger to frostbite. My digestive system never fully recovered from those 3 weeks. Certain foods make me violently ill, while others that should disgust me don't. I still crave raw meat sometimes, especially when I'm stressed or tired. My doctor thinks it's psychological, but I know better. The worst part isn't the physical damage. It's how normal those 3 weeks felt by the end. How natural it became to think of people as prey. How easy it was to smile and wave while marking someone for death. I still drive through the mountains sometimes when I need to get somewhere and the interstate is too crowded. I tell myself it's efficient, that I'm just taking the most direct route, but really I'm looking for brokey and down cars, for travelers who might need help, for the kind of people the Crane family would have chosen. I've never stopped, never offered help, but I think about it every single time. And sometimes, when I see some young person stranded on a lonely mountain road, I understand why Mrs. Crane's eyes lit up when she talked about the Lord providing gifts. Some hungers never go away, no matter how civilized you think you've become. The Crane family is gone, but their legacy isn't. It's walking around in a clinic manager's uniform, smiling at patients and asking about their families and wondering what they'd taste like if nobody was watching. That's the real horror of what happened to me. Not that I survived, but that I learned to see the world the way they did. And once you see people as prey, once you understand how easy it would be to take someone who wouldn't be missed right away, you can never unsee it. I'm still that 19-year-old girl who knocked on their door. But I'm also something else now. Something that understands why they smiled when they talked about hunting season. And hunting season never really ends. I'm 21 years old and I deliver pizzas for Romano's in Pikeville, Kentucky. It's not glamorous work, but the night shift pays decent and lets me take classes during the day at the community college. I'm studying to be an electrician, which means I need every dollar I can scrape together for textbooks and certification fees. Most nights I stick to the usual routes: apartment complexes, trailer parks, the occasional suburban house. But that October night, I got an order that took me somewhere I'd never been before, and honestly, I wish I'd just told my manager the customer could come pick it up themselves. The order came in around 11:30 p.m., 3 large pizzas to an address in Whitman Hollow. I'd heard of the place but never delivered there. It's one of those remote mountain areas where people moved to get away from everyone else. The customer paid by credit card over the phone and promised a $50 cash tip if I could get it there before midnight. $50 would cover my chemistry textbook, so I loaded up my beat-up Honda Civic and headed out. The GPS on my phone worked fine until I got about 10 miles up Route 194. Then it just cut out completely. No signal, no map, nothing. Lucky for me, the customer had given detailed directions over the phone, and I'd written them down on a napkin. Turn left at the old Shell station, follow the gravel road for 3 miles, look for mailbox number 11847. Simple enough, except the gravel road kept branching off in different directions, and none of the forks had any kind of signs. I drove for what felt like forever, my headlights cutting through mountain darkness so thick it seemed solid. No other houses, no street lights, just trees pressing in on both sides of the narrow road. The silence was complete. No insects, no wind, nothing. Even my radio had gone to static. I was starting to think I'd taken a wrong turn when my lights finally picked up a rusty mailbox with 1847 painted on it in faded white numbers. The driveway was long and winding, probably a quarter-mile through dense woods. When I finally reached the house, it looked normal enough, a 2-story log cabin with warm yellow light glowing in the windows. A man in his 40s answered the door, followed by what looked like his wife and teenage son. Dr. Marcus Brennan, he introduced himself, a wildlife biologist from the University of Cincinnati. His wife Sarah was an anthropologist, and their son David was homeschooled, helping with their research project. They seemed nice, paid cash like they'd promised, and even added an extra 10 on top of the 50 for my trouble. "We really appreciate you coming all the way out here," Dr. Brennan said as he handed me the money. "Most delivery places won't even try to find us." His wife smiled apologetically. "We're documenting some unusual wildlife behavior in the area. It requires us to be pretty isolated." I thanked them, grabbed my insulated bag, and headed back to my car. That's when things went wrong. My engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was completely dead, which made no sense because the car had been running fine all night. I tried everything, checking the connections, turning on the hazard lights to see if there was any juice left, even popping the hood to look for loose wires. Nothing. The family must have heard me struggling because Dr. Brennan came out with a flashlight. "Car trouble?" he asked, then examined my engine. "Looks like your battery's been completely drained. That's strange. These mountain roads don't usually cause electrical problems." He offered to let me wait inside while I called for a tow truck. I figured it beats sitting in a dead car in the middle of nowhere, so I followed him back to the house. That's when I noticed something strange about the place. Security cameras, dozens of them. They were mounted under the eaves, on fence posts, even hanging from tree branches around the property. All different types, some regular, some with infrared capability, some that looked expensive enough to belong to the government. Inside was even weirder. The living room had an entire wall covered with monitors, maybe 20 screens showing different views of the forest around the house. Every possible angle was covered. "Impressive setup," I said, trying not to sound too curious. "Necessary for our research," Sarah explained, settling into one of 3 chairs positioned facing the monitors. "We're documenting the behavior patterns of some very elusive subjects." David, their son, was maybe 16 and clearly spent most of his time watching the screens. He had notebooks filled with timestamps, behavioral observations, and detailed sketches of movement patterns. "Dad started this project after the disappearances," he said, then quickly looked at his parents like he'd said something wrong. "Disappearances?" I asked. Dr. Brennan looked uncomfortable. Several hikers and hunters have gone missing in this area over the past few years. The local authorities assume they got lost or had accidents, but we think there might be an undocumented species responsible. Around midnight, the cameras started picking up movement. Large shapes moving through the trees, just at the edge of the infrared range. All three family members immediately focused on the screens, tracking the figures as they moved from camera to camera. The shapes were tall, maybe 7 feet, and they moved in a coordinated pattern, like they were patrolling specific boundaries. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing to screen 7, Alpha Formation, just like Tuesday night. I leaned closer to get a better look. The figures were definitely bipedal, with elongated limbs that seemed wrong even in the grainy infrared footage. But it was their hands that made my stomach turn. The fingers were easily twice as long as they should be, thin and jointed in too many places, like spider legs attached to human arms. When they moved, those fingers would flex and curl in ways that hurt to watch. "What are those?" I asked. Dr. Brennan hesitated, then pulled out a thick file folder. Inside were photos, video stills, and audio recordings spanning 3 years of research. "We call them the Watchers," he said. "They've been living in these mountains for generations, maybe centuries. They're highly intelligent, territorial, and they study human behavior." The photos were disturbing. Close-up shots showed pale, almost translucent skin stretched over frames that were too tall and too thin. Their faces were vaguely human but wrong in every detail. Eyes set too far apart, no visible nose, and mouths that seemed to split their heads too wide when open. But those fingers were in every image, impossibly long digits that they used to manipulate objects with surgical precision. "They arrange things," Sarah explained, showing me pictures of stone circles, stick formations, and small animal bones laid out in complex patterns. Territorial markers, we think. But also something else. They're studying us just as intensely as we're studying them. "How do you know that?" I asked. David pulled out another notebook, this one filled with dates and locations. Missing items from campsites. Hikers report tools disappearing, then finding them arranged in specific patterns miles away. Food taken from sealed containers without the containers being damaged. And voices. Voices? "They mimic human speech," Dr. Brennan said quietly. "They listen to people talking, then practice the sounds when they think no one's around. But they get the rhythm wrong, the emphasis. It sounds like someone trying to speak a foreign language they don't understand." On the monitors, I watched the tall figures move through the forest with fluid, predatory grace. They communicated through a series of clicking sounds that the microphones picked up clearly. The clicks had rhythm and pattern, definitely language, but nothing like anything I'd ever heard. "They're beautiful and—" "Away," Sarah said, her voice full of academic fascination. "Perfectly adapted to their environment, silent movement, excellent night vision, incredible problem-solving abilities. We think they've been avoiding human contact for decades, maybe longer." "Then why study them at all?" I asked. Dr. Brennan's expression darkened. "Because they're getting bolder. The missing persons cases are increasing. Last month, a family of 4 disappeared from a campsite just 5 miles from here. Their tents were still standing, food still cooking on the camp stove, but no signs of struggle. It was like they just vanished." The clicking sounds from the monitors grew more complex, more urgent. The Watchers were gathering near the property line, maybe a dozen of them now. Their movements became more coordinated, like they were organizing for something. "This is unusual," David said, checking his notes. "They normally maintain distance on Friday nights. Weekends are their quiet period." That's when every light in the house went out. The monitors went dark, the hum of electronics died, and we were plunged into complete blackness. Through the windows, I could see that my car's interior light had also gone out, which meant something had drained its battery completely. "Generators should kick in automatically," Dr. Brennan said, but his voice carried a note of concern I hadn't heard before. Silence. No generator, no backup power. Even their battery-powered emergency radio wouldn't turn on. Then we heard them outside. The clicking sounds were much closer now, coming from multiple directions around the house. But underneath the clicks, there was something else. A sound like fingers drumming against wood, but with too many beats, too many digits. Sarah grabbed my arm. "They've never approached the house before," she whispered. "Never. They observe from the forest, maintain territorial bound, Aries. This isn't normal behavior." Through the darkness, I could make out pale shapes moving past the windows. They were tall enough that their heads reached the second-story windows without ladders, and those impossibly long fingers were pressed against the glass, testing, exploring, leaving smudge marks that looked like handprints from something that definitely wasn't human. One of them tested the front door handle. Just once, a careful downward pressure with what sounded like multiple fingers working in coordination. When it didn't open, I heard those spider-like digits tapping against the door frame in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. "They're learning," David whispered, and I could hear the terror in his voice. "They've been watching us work the door handles. They know how human mechanisms function." The footsteps moved around the house to the back door. Same careful testing. Then the windows, one by one, each getting gentle pressure from those two long fingers. They were systematically checking every entry point, working as a team, communicating through soft clicking sounds. But the worst part was when they started making human sounds. First, it was just fragments. Single words repeated with wrong emphasis. Hello, hello, hello. Stretched out too long, the syllables placed wrong. Then phrases. We're documenting some unusual wildlife. In Dr. Brennan's voice, but flat and lifeless, like a recording played back on broken equipment. They've been listening to us, Sarah breathed. Recording everything we say. The mimicry got more complex. I heard my own voice coming from somewhere near the kitchen window. What are those? What are those? What are those? Over and over, but with pauses in the wrong places, like someone learning to speak by copying sounds they didn't understand. Then David's voice, young and frightened. Dad started this project after the disappearances. But it wasn't David speaking. It was coming from outside, from something with a mouth that probably couldn't form human words properly. For maybe an hour, we listened to them moving around outside, testing our defenses, practicing our voices. Sometimes the clicking would stop, and we'd hear breathing near the windows. Heavy, deliberate breathing, but with a wet, whistling quality that suggested respiratory systems different from ours. Dr. Brennan was frantically trying to process what was happening. They're displaying learned behavior, he whispered. Tool use, vocal mimicry, coordinated group tactics. This suggests intelligence levels far beyond what we documented. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, I don't think we're the researchers here. I think we're the specimens. That's when we heard glass breaking in the basement. They'd found the window we'd forgotten about, the one that didn't have security bars because it was too small for adult humans to fit through. But these things weren't built like humans. Those elongated frames could probably compress and squeeze through spaces that would be impossible for us. The clicking sounds moved inside the house, multiple sets of footsteps on the wooden floor below us. They were searching room by room, and they were being methodical about it. I could hear them opening cabinets, drawers, examining our possessions with those impossibly long fingers. Then one of them found Dr. Brennan's research files. The clicking became more excited, more rapid. I heard papers rustling, photos being shuffled, and then something that made my blood freeze. My own voice coming from the basement, reading aloud from the research notes. Territorial markers. Study human behavior. Highly intelligent. They were learning about themselves, reading our documentation of their species like a manual. They're in my study, Dr. Brennan whispered. 3 years of research, behavioral patterns, territorial maps, population estimates, everything. The footsteps climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately, multiple sets, maybe 4 or 5 of them. They stopped outside our barricaded bedroom door. I could see shadows moving under the door frame, blocking out what little ambient light there was. Then I heard something that still gives me nightmares. David's voice coming from the hallway. Dad, I'm scared. Dad, help me. Dad, please don't let them take me. But David was right next to me, pressed against the wall, not making a sound. "That's not me," he whispered. "That's not me saying that." The voice got more desperate, more pleading. "Dad, why won't you help me? Why are you hiding? Dad, please." Dr. Brennan started crying, quiet, broken sobs as he listened to something wearing his son's voice, using his child's fear against him. The door handle turned, not quickly, not violently. Slowly, carefully, those two long fingers working the mechanism with precise understanding of how it functioned. The lock held, but I could hear them testing it, learning its limitations. Then the voices stopped. The clicking stopped. Complete silence from the hallway. That's when I heard the sound that made me run. Breathing, right against the door. But not one set of lungs, multiple respiratory systems working in unison, creating a rhythm that no human could produce. And underneath it, barely audible, the sound of those spider-like fingers tapping against the wood in patterns that might have been communication, or might have been some kind of countdown. I don't remember making the decision to move. One second I was frozen against the wall, the next I was smashing through the bedroom window and dropping onto the roof of the back porch. Glass cut my arms, my legs, but I barely felt it. I rolled off the edge and hit the ground hard, then just started running toward where I thought my car was parked. Behind me, I heard the family screaming, but underneath their voices, I heard other sounds. The same voices, but wrong, like echoes with different timing. Something was learning to scream like humans, and it was getting better at it with each attempt. I found my car and dove inside, not even bothering to try the ignition. But somehow, impossibly, it started on the first turn. The headlights came on, the radio crackled back to life, and my phone showed full signal again. I threw it in reverse and got out of there as fast as the narrow driveway would allow. In my rearview mirror, I saw them. 3 tall, pale figures standing in the driveway watching me leave. Their 2 long fingers were held at their sides, perfectly still, and their heads turned to follow my car with mechanical precision. They didn't chase me. They didn't need to. They'd gotten what they came for. I drove straight to the sheriff's department in Pikeville and told them everything. They sent a car out to check on the Brennan family the next morning, but when they got there, the house was empty. Not just empty, completely clean. No furniture, no monitoring equipment, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. Even the security cameras were gone. But here's what the police report didn't mention, what the deputy told me off the record when I asked him about it later. They found Dr. Brennan's research files scattered in the basement. Every page had been carefully examined, photographed with some kind of equipment they couldn't identify. And written in the margins, in handwriting that looked almost human but not quite, were notes. Corrections to the behavioral observations, updates to the population estimates, detailed additions about hunting patterns and territorial expansion. The watchers had been studying the people who were studying them, and now they had 3 years of research about human behavior, told from a human perspective. The deputy also told me something else. 3 more families have disappeared from remote mountain properties in the past 6 months. Always the same pattern. Houses found empty, no signs of struggle, all electronics and research equipment gone. But neighbors riposo aren't hearing voices in the woods afterward. Familiar voices calling out names of people who are no longer there. I still deliver pizzas for Romanos, but I don't take orders to remote addresses anymore. I stick to the main roads, the well-lit neighborhoods, places where there are other people around. And sometimes, when I'm driving the mountain roads for regular deliveries, I'll catch myself checking the rearview mirror more than I should, because I know they're still out there, watching, and I think they remember me. Sometimes when I'm getting ready for work, I'll hear my phone ring and no one will be there when I answer. But in the background, real quiet, I can hear clicking sounds. And sometimes my own voice played back with just slightly wrong timing. What are those? What are those? They're learning to be us, and they're getting better at it every day. I'm 34 years old, and I've been running construction crews in the Virginia mountains for 15 years now. Born and raised right here in these hills, know every back road and hunting trail like the back of my hand. Name's Marcus, and honestly, I never thought I'd be the kind of guy telling stories like this one. But after what happened on Bloodroot Ridge last fall, well, some things change a man. See, my wife Sarah got diagnosed with lupus right around that time, and the medical bills were piling up faster than I could pay them. Insurance didn't cover half of what she needed, and I was getting desperate. That's when this developer from Richmond called me up, offering triple my normal rate to clear some land for luxury cabins. The catch was the location, Bloodroot Ridge, up in the eastern part of the county where nobody really goes anymore. My grandfather used to warn me about that ridge when I was little. Said there was something wrong with the soil up there, something that made things grow different. He'd worked logging crews in these mountains back in the 50s, and he always told me to stay away from Bloodroot Ridge specifically. That ground's got a memory, Marcus, he'd say. Some places hold on to the bad things that happened there. Of course, I figured it was just old mountain superstition. Grandpa had a story for every hollow and ridge around here. But the money was good, really good, and Sarah needed those treatments. So I put together my regular crew. Danny, who'd been working with me for 8 years, Pete, solid as a rock and twice as stubborn, and Jake, a new kid fresh out of trade school who was eager to prove himself. We drove up to the ridge on a Monday morning in October, fog still hanging low between the trees. First thing I noticed was the soil. Soon as we started unloading equipment, you could see it, this dark red dirt that looked almost black in some spots. Danny kicked at it with his boot and made some joke about it looking like dried blood, but honestly, that's exactly what it looked like. The developer's supervisor, this guy in a fancy suit who clearly hadn't spent much time outdoors, just told us to ignore the color and focus on clearing the timber. Said they wanted the whole ridge cleared in 3 weeks, and there'd be a bonus if we finished early. First week went smooth enough. We were making good progress, cutting down oak and pine that must have been growing there for decades. But there were things that bothered me right from the start. When we'd cut into the bigger trees, they'd leak this red sap that was thicker than normal, almost sticky. Jake said he'd never seen tree sap that dark before, and he was right. It looked wrong somehow. Plus, we kept finding things in the soil. Not just rocks and roots like you'd expect, but pieces of metal, old rusted bits that looked like they might have been tools or weapons once. Pete found what looked like part of an old musket ball, all corroded and green. Thursday of that first week, I stopped at Emma's diner in town to grab lunch for the crew. Soon as I mentioned we were working Bloodroot Ridge, the whole place went quiet. I mean dead quiet, like someone had turned off a radio. Old Emma just looked at me with these worried eyes and shook her head. "Y'all shouldn't be up there," she said. But when I asked why, she just packed up my order and wouldn't say another word. A few of the older guys at the counter were whispering among themselves, but they clammed up when I tried to listen in. Looking back now, I should have paid attention to those warnings. But I had bills to pay and a schedule to keep, so we pushed forward. By the end of the second week, though, things started getting weird. Really weird. We'd find our tools moved around in the morning, arranged in strange patterns we definitely hadn't left them in. Equipment kept breaking down for no good reason. Chainsaws that had been running fine would suddenly seize up, and our bulldozers, hydraulics started acting up even though it had just been serviced. Jake, being the college boy, decided to do some research on the area. What he found made my blood run cold. Turns out Bloodroot Ridge had been the site of a massacre during the Civil War. Union and Confederate forces had met there in 1863, and it had been a bloodbath. Hundreds of men died on that ridge in a single afternoon, and apparently most of them were never properly buried. Just left where they fell. The ground-penetrating radar that the developers had used before hiring us showed bodies scattered all over the property, way more than anyone had expected. That's when the night sounds started. We'd camp on the ridge sometimes to get an early start the next morning, and after dark, you could hear things that made no sense. Musket fire echoing through the trees, men shouting orders in voices that sounded like they were coming from underwater. Sometimes we'd hear screaming, the kind of screaming that comes from men dying hard and afraid. Danny tried to joke about it, said maybe we were just hearing sounds from the highway carrying on the wind, but there wasn't any highway within 10 miles of that ridge. By the third week, we were all feeling it. Constant headaches, nosebleeds that came out of nowhere, and this weird aggression that none of us could shake. Pete, who was normally the most easygoing guy you'd ever meet, started picking fights over nothing. Danny was snapping at everyone, and Jake looked like he hadn't slept in days. I wasn't much better. Kept having these dreams where I was someone else, somewhere else, holding a rifle I didn't recognize and wearing clothes that weren't mine. The really bad stuff started on a Wednesday morning. We were cutting trees near the center of the ridge when Danny just stopped working. Stood there leaning on his chainsaw, staring off into the woods with this blank expression. When I called his name, he turned around and started talking in this old-timey accent, saying things like, "The boys are coming up the hill," and "We need to hold this position." It was like Danny wasn't there anymore, like someone else was wearing his face. Jake got spooked and tried to shake Danny out of it, and that's when Pete went crazy. Grabbed a shovel and swung it at Jake's head. Would have killed him if Jake hadn't ducked. Pete had this wild look in his eyes, like he didn't even recognize us. After a minute, he dropped the shovel and looked around confused, asking why Jake was on the ground and why everyone was staring at him. That's when I realized what was happening. The ridge wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. All that blood soaked into the soil over the years, all those men who died violent deaths, it had turned the place into something that fed on violence, and we were giving it exactly what it wanted. The next morning, things got worse. We'd all started having these episodes where we'd black out and come to holding weapons that weren't ours. Old-style bayonets, musket balls, even a cavalry saber that definitely hadn't been there before. During these episodes, we'd be fighting each other like our lives depended on it. But when we snapped out of it, none of us could remember why we'd been fighting or where the weapons had come from. Jake did more research and found out we were reenacting actual battle scenes from 1863. Every detail matched historical records, the positions we took, the weapons we used, even the words we shouted during the fights. It was like the ridge was making us relive that massacre over and over again, and each time we did it, the spirits got stronger. Friday morning, Jake didn't snap out of it. Danny had gotten hold of a bayonet somehow, and when the possession took over, he drove it right into Jake's shoulder. The kid was bleeding bad, and for the first time, I realized we might not all make it off that ridge alive. The spirits weren't just playing anymore. They wanted us to join them permanently. That's when I made the decision that probably saved our lives. We had explosives on site for clearing some of the bigger stumps, and I figured if we couldn't fight the spirits, maybe we could destroy what was feeding them. The ridge itself was their anchor, all that blood-soaked soil holding them to this world. If we could level the whole thing, maybe they'd finally be able to move on. Soon as I started moving toward the explosives, hundreds of them appeared. Confederate soldiers, Union troops, all standing between us and the detonator. They looked solid as you or me, but when you looked close, you could see through them to the trees behind. They were all carrying weapons, all ready to fight to keep us from destroying their battlefield. What followed was the most terrifying 15 minutes of my life. We had to fight our way through an army of ghosts using construction equipment as weapons. Pete grabbed a chainsaw and went at them like it was a cavalry saber. Danny, when he was himself, used a sledgehammer like a war club. Even Jake, bleeding from his shoulder, picked up a crowbar and started swinging. The weird thing was, the ghosts could touch us, but we could barely touch them. They'd grab our tools right out of our hands, throw us around like we weighed nothing. But they seemed to be afraid of the explosives, kept backing away from them like they knew what we were planning. Danny died, trying to hold them off so I could reach the detonator. A Confederate officer ran him through with a sword, and when Danny fell, he didn't get back up. But he'd bought me enough time to set the charges and get clear. When those explosives went off, the whole ridge just disappeared. Biggest explosion I'd ever seen, and I'd done demolition work before. The blast leveled every tree for half a mile, turned all that blood-red soil into a crater 50 feet deep. And as the smoke cleared, I swear I could see them. Thousands of spirits rising up from the wreckage, finally free to go wherever it is spirits go when they're done fighting. Pete died 2 days later in the hospital. The possession had done something to his brain, the doctor said. Jake survived, but his right arm never worked right again. He can't do construction anymore, ended up taking a desk job in Richmond. As for me, well, I can't work construction either. My hands shake too badly now, especially when I'm around loud machinery. Sarah got her treatments and she's doing better, but I haven't told her how I really paid for them. I visit Danny's grave every week, bring flowers, and tell him about how his kids are doing in school. His wife deserved to know how he died saving us, but the official report said it was a gas line explosion. Military came in and classified the whole thing, said it was a matter of national security. I don't go up in the mountains much anymore. Stick to the valleys, the civilized places, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind's blowing just right, I swear I can still hear them up there. Not fighting anymore, just marching, moving on to whatever comes after war. That ridge is gone now, turned into a lake when the crater filled with rainwater. The development company went bankrupt after the accident, and the land got turned into a memorial park. They put up a plaque about the Civil War battle, but it doesn't mention what we found up there or what we had to do to put those boys to rest. I still live in these mountains, but I pay attention to the old stories now. When the old-timers talk about places that are wrong, places with memories, I listen. Because some ground really does hold on to the bad things that happened there. And sometimes it takes more than time to heal those wounds. Sometimes it takes dynamite. I'm 16 years old, and I guess I should start by saying I'll never go on another school camping trip for the rest of my life. My name's Jessica, and back in October of my junior year at Mountain View High School in North Carolina, our biology teacher, Mr. Peterson, organized this overnight field trip to study the Appalachian ecosystem. It was supposed to be educational, you know? We were going to collect plant samples, study forest ecology, earn some extra credit. 24 of us signed up, plus 3 teachers to supervise. Honestly, it seemed like a good way to get out of regular classes for a couple days, and the fall colors were supposed to be beautiful that time of year. The trip started out completely normal. We piled into the school buses that Thursday morning, all excited and loud like teenagers get. Mr. Peterson was leading the trip along with Ms. Garcia from the science department and Coach Williams, who was there mostly to help with the camping stuff. The plan was simple. Drive up to this state forest campsite, set up our tents, do some nature walks to collect specimens, and head back Friday afternoon. Perfect October weather, too. Clear skies and those amazing fall colors you see in postcards. When we got to the campsite around noon, everything felt right. It was this designated camping area deep in the forest, with fire pits and picnic tables already set up. The trees were incredible. All these reds and golds and oranges, like someone had painted the whole mountainside. We spent the afternoon setting up our tents in groups, with the teachers making sure everyone knew the basic camping rules. Stay with your buddy, don't wander off alone, lights out by 10 p.m., that kind of thing. Dinner was your typical camping food, hot dogs and s'mores cooked over the fire pit. Ms. Garcia led us on this evening nature walk where we identified different tree species and talked about how the ecosystem changes through the seasons. Some of the kids were more interested in the usual high school drama stuff, but I actually enjoyed learning about the forest. Brad and Ashley were being all coupley, Jamie and Chris were joking around like they always did, and David was taking pictures of everything with his digital camera. Just normal teenage stuff, you know? That first night, I slept great. The sounds of the forest were actually really peaceful. Wind through the trees, maybe an owl hooting somewhere in the distance. I remember thinking this was going to be a really good trip. I woke up Friday morning to Mr. Peterson's voice calling for everyone to gather around the main fire pit for breakfast. But when we did our head count, Brad and Ashley were missing. Their tent was still zipped up tight, and when Ms. Garcia checked inside, their sleeping bags looked like they'd never been slept in. Like they'd never even gone to bed Thursday night. Mr. Peterson tried to stay calm, asking if anyone had seen them after lights out. Nobody had. Their backpacks were still in the tent, their phones, everything. Coach Williams organized us into search groups to look around the immediate campsite area, thinking maybe they'd gotten up early to watch the sunrise or something. But we found nothing. No footprints leading away from camp, no signs of a struggle, nothing. The weird part was our cell phones. None of us could get any signal, which seemed strange because we'd all had at least a couple bars when we arrived yesterday. Mr. Peterson had a radio for emergencies, but it was just picking up static. He kept trying different channels, getting more frustrated each time. That's when things started getting really wrong. While we were searching for Brad and Ashley, 3 more students disappeared: Jamie, Chris, and David. One minute they were checking the trail markers. About 50 yards from camp, The next minute they were gone, just like that. Ms. Garcia was with that search group, and she said she'd turned around for maybe 30 seconds to call back to Mr. Peterson, and when she looked again, they weren't there. Now we were down 5 students, and everyone was starting to panic. The teachers tried to keep us calm, but you could see they were scared too. Coach Williams made the decision to pack everything up and head back to the buses immediately. Forget the biology samples, forget the extra credit. We needed to get out of there and contact the authorities. But here's where it gets really messed up. The trail back to the parking lot, the same trail we'd hiked in on yesterday, was different. I know that sounds crazy, but I swear the markers weren't in the same places. There were paths branching off that I didn't remember seeing before. Mr. Peterson had a GPS unit, but it kept showing conflicting information, like we were in 3 different locations at once. We walked for hours. Hours. Following what should have been a simple 2-mile trail back to where we'd left the buses. But every time we thought we were making progress, we'd end up back at our original campsite. The same fire pit, the same picnic tables, the same spot where we'd set up our tents. It was like the forest was playing some kind of sick joke on us. That's when Ms. Garcia disappeared too. She was checking one of the trail markers, trying to figure out which direction we should go, and when we turned around, she was just gone. Her backpack was still sitting right where she'd set it down, but she was nowhere to be found. By this point, we were down to 15 students and 2 teachers, and everyone was starting to lose it. Some of the kids were crying, others were just sitting there staring into space like they'd shut down completely. Coach Williams kept trying the radio, but all we got was static. Our phones were completely dead now, not just no signal, but actually powered off like the batteries had been drained. Mr. Peterson found it first, deep out, and the forest maybe a mile from where our campsite kept appearing. There was this stone circle, really old-looking, with symbols carved into the rocks that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. But it wasn't just the circle that freaked us out. It was all the stuff scattered around it. Backpacks, sleeping bags, personal items that looked like they'd been there for years. Different styles, different decades even. Some of the stuff looked really old, like from the 70s or 80s, and some of it looked recent. There was a digital camera that might have been from just a few years ago. A smartphone in a cracked case, jewelry, clothes. That's when we realized what was happening. This thing, whatever it was, had been taking people for a long time, decades probably, and now it was taking us. Coach Williams started acting strange then, really strange. He kept walking around the stone circle, studying those carved symbols like he was reading them. When Mr. Peterson asked what he was doing, Coach Williams just smiled and said something about how it's time for the harvest. I still get chills thinking about that smile. It wasn't right. Wasn't human. That's when I understood that Coach Williams had brought us here on purpose. This wasn't just a biology field trip gone wrong. This was planned. He'd been working with whatever lived in these woods, bringing students up here like some kind of offering. The entity, I don't know what else to call it, started hunting us actively after that. We could hear it moving through the trees, making these sounds that were almost like voices, but not quite. Like it was trying to mimic human speech, but getting the rhythm wrong. Sometimes it sounded like our missing friends calling for help, but there was something off about the voices. Too flat, too hollow. We tried everything we could think of. Built signal fires, used mirrors to reflect sunlight. Screamed until our voices gave out. Nothing worked. The forest had us trapped, and this thing was picking us off one by one whenever we let our guard down. But here's the thing about being 16 and terrified. You get creative. While the teachers were arguing about what to do next, me and the other students started using the one advantage we had. Our phones might not have had signal, but they still had batteries and cameras and flashlights. We figured out that bright lights seemed to confuse the entity, especially camera flashes. The thing didn't like sudden illumination. We formed a tight circle around that stone ring and started using every piece of technology we had. Phone screens on full brightness, camera flashes going off in sequence, even the LED lights from our MP3 players. It worked. The thing stopped hunting us and started keeping its distance. Then Sarah, she was always the smart one in our class, had this idea. She started using her phone to post on social media, tagging our location with GPS coordinates from before the phones went weird. Even though we couldn't get signal, the posts were saving as drafts. If we could ever get signal back, they'd upload automatically and show exactly where we were. Saturday morning, we heard helicopters. Search and rescue had finally found us, guided by those GPS coordinates that had uploaded when we briefly got signal on a ridge. They airlifted us out, 8 at a time. Out of 24 students, only 8 of us made it home. The investigation afterward was massive. They found Coach Williams's body in the forest, though the official report said he'd gotten lost and died of exposure. But I know what really happened to him. When the rescue helicopters showed up, that thing in the woods was done with him. He'd served his purpose. They also found evidence going back decades. Missing person reports from school trips, scout groups, church camps. All the same area, all young people, all during October when the leaves were changing. The school district shut down Mountain View High permanently after that. Too many questions they couldn't answer. I'm 23 now, graduated from a different school, working at a bank in Charlotte. I've never been camping since then, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes I have dreams about those stone circles, about voices in the forest that sound almost human, but not quite. And every October, when the leaves start changing colors, I make sure I'm nowhere near the mountains. The 8 of us who survived, we don't really talk about it. What's the point? Nobody would believe us anyway. But sometimes I wonder about those other kids, Brad and Ashley, Jamie and Chris, David, Ms. Garcia. I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, if that thing keeps them alive somehow, or if they became part of the forest itself. I guess I'll never know. And honestly, I'm okay with that. Some things are better left buried in the woods where they belong. I'm 45 years old and work as a cell tower technician across West Virginia. Been doing this job for 15 years now, driving all over these mountains, fixing towers when storms knock them out or equipment goes bad. Most days it's routine work. Replace a few components, run some diagnostics, drive home. I've seen every kind of tower from the big ones near Charleston to the tiny repeaters stuck on ridges nobody even knows exist. The company I work for maintains about 60 towers across 3 counties, and I know every single one like the back of my hand. My truck's got all the test equipment, spectrum analyzers, signal meters, laptop with the network software. I can usually spot what's wrong before I even get out of the cab. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October. Dispatch said we had signal interference on the Bear Mountain Tower, way up past Beckley on a service road I'd only been to maybe 3 times in all my years. People in the valley were complaining about dropped calls and slow data. The tower itself was sending normal status reports, so it wasn't a power issue or structural damage. Had to be electromagnetic interference from somewhere nearby. Maybe someone put up an unlicensed repeater, or there was some old mining equipment causing problems. I loaded up the truck with extra test gear and headed out, figuring I'd be home by dinner. The drive up Bear Mountain takes about an hour from the main road. It's all switchbacks and gravel past the first few miles, with nothing but forest on both sides. No houses, no other roads, just trees and the occasional old gate across a logging trail. The tower sits in a cleared area at the top, maybe 100 feet from the tree line. Company put it there back in 2007 when they needed coverage for the valleys on both sides of the ridge. It's a good location, high elevation, clear line of sight, easy maintenance access. And I'd been up there in spring for routine checks and never had any problems. When I got to the tower around noon, everything looked normal. The structure was solid, no storm damage or ice buildup from last winter. All the equipment cabinets were secure, and the backup generator had fuel. I ran through the standard checklist first. Power systems, cooling, network connectivity. Everything checked out fine. But when I fired up the spectrum analyzer, that's when things got weird. The interference was definitely there, but it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Most interference shows up as broad spectrum noise or spikes at specific frequencies. This looked more like communication signals. Multiple sources, all coordinated, using frequencies that aren't allocated for anything. They'd transmit in short bursts, then go quiet, then pop up on different frequencies entirely. The pattern was too organized to be random noise, but it didn't match any known protocol I could identify. I spent the next hour trying to track down where the signals were coming from. Used the directional antenna to get a rough bearing, somewhere in the forest to the northeast, maybe half a mile away. Then I picked up more sources. And more. By the time I'd mapped out what I was seeing, there had to be at least a dozen transmitters scattered throughout the woods around the tower, all of them working together somehow, changing frequencies in sync, maintaining some kind of network that definitely wasn't there the last time I'd serviced this site. The smart thing would have been to pack up and report it to the FCC. Unlicensed transmitters are their problem, not mine. But I was curious. In 15 years of this work, I'd never seen anything like what those signals were doing. The power levels were all wrong. Too strong for the range, like they were using some kind of amplification I didn't understand. And the frequency hopping pattern didn't follow any standard I knew about. It was almost like the transmitters were learning, adapting their behavior based on some kind of feedback. I decided to take a walk into the woods and see if I could find one of the sources. Grabbed my handheld spectrum analyzer and a GPS unit, locked up the truck, and headed into the tree line. The bearing pointed me toward an old logging trail that disappeared into thick forest. I figured I'd follow it for maybe 20 minutes, see what I could find, then head back to finish the job. The first transmitter was about a quarter-mile in, attached to an oak tree about 10 feet off the ground. At first glance, it looked almost organic, kind of like a fungus or some kind of growth that had wrapped around the trunk. But when I got closer, I could see it was definitely artificial. The thing was maybe the size of a football, with what looked like biological components integrated into a structure that seemed more grown than manufactured. It had a slow, steady pulse like a heartbeat, and when I held up the analyzer, I could tell this was definitely one of my signal sources. That's when I started finding more of them. Following the GPS coordinates from my signal mapping, I located device after device throughout the forest. Some were attached to trees like the first one. Others were nestled in root systems or partially buried under fallen logs. A few looked like they'd been recently installed, still small, still growing into their positions. All of them had that same organic, almost alive appearance. All of them were pulsing in sync. Looking back now, I should have left right then. Should have headed back to the truck and gotten the hell off that mountain. But I kept thinking there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of environmental monitoring system or research equipment from the Forestry Service, though I couldn't figure out why they'd be using frequencies that would interfere with cell service, or why they'd build the devices to look so biologicus. It took me another hour to map the full network. At least 30 devices spread across maybe 2 square miles of forest, all connected, all working together. The pattern they formed wasn't random. It was a grid, like something designed to track movement through the area. Each device could monitor radio emissions, electronic signatures, maybe even heat or motion. Together, they created a surveillance network that could track anything moving through those woods with incredible precision. That's when I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't environmental monitoring equipment. This was hunting technology. Something was using these devices to track prey in the forest, and based on the signal characteristics I was seeing, that prey was specifically human beings. The frequency ranges, the power levels, the network coordination, everything was optimized to detect and follow human electromagnetic signatures. Cell phones, GPS units, even car key fobs, anything electronic that people carry. I was standing in the middle of a hunting ground, and I'd just become the target. The first sign something was wrong came from my own equipment. The spectrum analyzer started showing massive signal spikes, like the entire network had suddenly ramped up to full power. Then my GPS unit went dead. Then my phone. The signals weren't just interfering with communications anymore. They were actively jamming anything electronic within range. I tried the radio in my belt pack. Nothing but static. I started walking back toward the truck, but the interference got worse with every step. High-frequency sounds that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The devices were coordinating their response, triangulating on my position, adjusting their output to keep me disoriented. By the time I made it back to the service road, I could barely see straight from the electronic noise they were pumping out. And the truck wouldn't start. All the electrical systems were dead. No lights, no radio, no engine control computer. Something in that network had the ability to kill electronics at range, and they'd just disabled my only way off the mountain. I popped the hood and checked the battery connections, but everything looked fine. It was like the truck's computer had just been wiped clean. That's when I heard them moving in the forest. Not footsteps exactly, but something large pushing through the underbrush. Multiple sources coming from different directions. The signal network was guiding them toward me, giving them my exact position while keeping me trapped with dead equipment and electronic interference. I couldn't see what was out there, but I could track their movement by watching the device signals coordinate and shift. I had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the clearing, maybe less. The only thing I could think of was to try an electromagnetic pulse. I'd read about EMP effects on electronics, how a big enough surge could damage circuits and reset systems. I disconnected the truck's battery cables and jury-rigged a setup that would dump the entire charge through the alternator coil all at once. Not exactly textbook engineering, but desperate times and all that. When I shorted the connections, the pulse knocked out every device within maybe 100 yards. The interference stopped instantly, and I could hear the things in the forest suddenly go quiet, like they'd lost their guidance system. The truck's computer reset itself, and the engine turned over on the first try. I had maybe a 2-minute window before the network adapted and came back online. I drove down that mountain road faster than I've ever driven in my life. Didn't stop until I hit the main highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors for headlights that never came. The truck's electronics worked fine once I got away from Bear Mountain. My phone reconnected, GPS came back online, everything normal, like nothing had happened at all. I never went back to that tower. Told the company. The interference was sporadic and probably weather-related. Recommended they monitor it remotely for a few months and see if it cleared up on its own. They bought the explanation and moved on to other priorities. I kept the damaged device samples I'd collected, ran some tests on my own time. The materials weren't anything I could identify. Not entirely biological, not entirely artificial. Whatever built those things, it wasn't human technology. These days I stick to the towers near populated areas. Won't take calls for the remote sites anymore, especially up in the deep mountains where there's no cell coverage and no backup if something goes wrong. I still monitor the radio frequencies sometimes, listening for signals that don't belong. Sometimes I pick up traces of that same coordinated pattern, usually from ridgelines where normal people never go. I don't talk about what happened on Bear Mountain. Who'd believe it? But I'll tell you this much. There's something up in those woods that's been watching us for a long time, learning our patterns, studying our technology, setting up hunting grounds in places where nobody goes. And sooner or later, I think it's going to come down from the mountains and start hunting where people actually live. I just hope when that happens, we figure out how to fight back before it's too late.